How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the TAPED podcast, the most hypnotic podcast in the world. We're your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome to another edition of the Genre Essentials, where we tackle 12 of the best albums that we think are worthy of being essential to a certain genre.
People are going to take off.
I'm not talking like this anymore. Fuck that. Yeah, anyway, so... yeah, another genre essentials, and this time we're going to be doing one on the ambient genre. And there's a wide array of stuff that we could have picked for this episode. Actually, we didn't put down any honorable mentions, so there's no point for this segment. You all know how this works by now. We have 12 albums here. We're going to talk about them individually, explain why they're essential, give our thoughts and opinions on them, and yeah, just generally discuss them like we always do. So, you ready?
Mm-hmm. Hell yeah.
Alright, so we're going to start off in 1978, and of course, we're going to start off with arguably the godfather of ambient, with Brian Eno and his album Ambient 1, Music for Airports. This is his 6th solo album, I believe, and it's one of the most... It's from one of the most influential artists in the lane of ambient music, so he's pretty much the godfather of ambient music, and of course, we're talking about the one, the only Brian Eno. If we're going to talk about any artists on this list, it would have to be Brian Eno. Simply put, not as far as I'm aware, there are artists that have kind of predated Eno's work, but honestly, Eno is pretty much the one who had the most impact in its early years, and he pretty much defined the idea of music solely based around these ambient soundscapes and pieces of sound. And the album we decided to go with was literally titled Ambient 1. Brian Eno's early stuff is pretty varied for what it is. He dabbled in a lot of things in the 70s, ranging from art rock to pure ambient, and for me, I feel like Ambient 1 is just the best representation of a purely ambient Eno work, and for me, it's probably one of the best places to go if you want an early album that feels like the definitive ambient album. And honestly, as a whole, it's just a really great album, and it gets better for me every time I decide to turn it on and listen, because it's just such a subversive and hypnotic piece that just puts me in a trance-like state. Ambient 1 is very repetitive. It's featuring a lot of drawn-out tracks with motifs and long song structures, but for me, the tones and the moods that he was able to convey through the atmosphere and the motifs were just enough to keep it all the more engaging. Plus, the textures and the sound in this thing are so rich and layered. I think it's really great throughout, and on that merit, it just stands out to me as a just texturally rich piece of ambient. Eno was revolutionary for his ability to set a mood through his sound, and, he certainly does that, and that's a key strength that Ambient 1 has. And, it's just pure mood from start to finish. I do like the manipulations on the choral vocals and the electronics on this record too. I think the tracks are mainly piano-based are a very nice touch as well, and generally speaking, it's an album that, feels at peace. It's very peaceful, and it's incredibly soothing. It's 4 lengthy enough pieces that are just great all in all. First 2 especially are just transcendental, and yeah, I'd recommend more Brian Eno, but for now, Ambient 1 is the best offering, I would say, from him in the pure ambient stages of his career. And yeah, it's an essential album, well and truly.
Yeah, Ambient 1 is just such a fitting name for what is basically the epitome of an ambient album. As you said, it wasn't the first ever ambient album, but it was certainly the first one to be referred to as an ambient album. It was actually designed to be a sound installation that was to be played at loop on at airports, obviously due to the subtitle of the album, because it's very atmospheric, it's very minimalistic, and meditative qualities were designed to diffuse the anxiousness, the intensity, and the atmosphere of airport terminals, which to this day is still just a major quality in ambient music. It's a meditative type of music that is created to just diffuse stressful situations. It's as Eno self-describes it, it's as ignorable as it is interesting, and it's made to induce calm and a space to think. So I think keeping those things in mind and the principles that the genre was founded on, it's easy to see why this is such an important moment in the foundation of ambient music, and why even 50 years later, almost 50 years later, it's still looked back at fondly. It's still hailed as a pioneering project. because Eno's ideas still reverberate to this day in, many of the ambient artists we see every day. The music here, it's as calm, as serene as you would ever like it to be. Eno just does a lot with his, very minimalistic tape loops, and he creates just this almost overwhelmingly beautiful atmosphere. It's just so serene. It's an album that it never fails to, relax, and it never fails to, just as he intended it to diffuse anxious situations. It's just, it's a masterpiece, and it's easy to see why this is kind of considered the album that started it all in terms of ambient music. Not, necessarily the first ambient album, but the one ambient album whose principles definitely marked like a change and a foundation in the genre, and are still looked back at fondly to this day.
Yeah, I like every single track on Ambient 1, and I have no least favorite tracks.
Yeah, same, but I will give a shout out to the first track because it's definitely my favorite.
Yeah, the first one is just gorgeous.
Let me introduce you to the next album, a personal favorite of mine. The KLF's Chill Out. Chill Out is the third studio album by British electronic group The KLF, released in early 1990. It is a sample-heavy concept album which portrays a nighttime journey through the US Gulf Coast states. When looking back at Brian Eno's initial description of ambient music, that the genre was one that at its core is very... at its core was created to be a very meditative experience, and one which can, transport the listener into a more serene and calm place. If I'm ever looking for those exact qualities in an album, Chill Out just delivers. This album is one which, through its sampling and its atmospheres and its compositions, just paints a very vivid journey, as I previously mentioned, across the US states of Texas and Louisiana. And, this kind of concept is just, it definitely helps this album transport you to where the KLF initially intended, whereas a lot of ambient projects, just kind of transport you to a more calm and more serene place. I definitely appreciate how the KLF here had a set destination in mind, and a set, number of like qualities and, soundscapes and samples. The samples are definitely important here, which, their purpose was to transport you into these specific areas, and I think they do that perfectly. It's absolutely vivid. The concept is just beautifully what's the word? I can't talk. Executed, and there's really nothing quite like it. It's more so than any other album on the list. It really does have a lot of power in being able to transport you. The sampling on here definitely does play a big part in that. Little snippets of Elvis tracks and throat singing. It does remind me of rural Southern America perfectly. It just, those little snippets feel kind of like moments in time, on this journey that the KLF so perfectly crafted. To me, the Elvis sample definitely stands out, and that moment is just one of the most cathartic in any ambient album I've ever heard. Overall, this album is possibly more so than any other one on this list an experience. It's almost like, a film soundtrack with no film. And it's a masterpiece, and it's absolutely insane that this was released in 1990. There was really not much like it back then, and it's easy to see why this album has become a cult classic. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. It's easy to see why this has become a cult classic, and just generally speaking, it's just very unique in the ambient genre. I suppose just calling Chill Out by the KLF a full-blown ambient album would honestly be doing it a bit of a disservice, since it's more than just an ambient album to me. In fact, it's just a really interesting piece that features some very eclectic influences and some strange yet interesting samples and recording that tie into this weird concept incredibly well. And as an experience, it's really damn great if you ask me. Cheers to Koner for explaining the concept of this album, and you as well. And, since it made much more sense to me afterward. Chill Out is essentially just one long 45-minute piece that features, very strange field recordings and various samples, and it's tied into this concept, around this Just basically a train. Is it a train ride through the southern states, something like that?
I don't know if it's specified to be a train ride, but I think the train samples definitely indicate it's a train ride.
Oh yeah. So yeah, it's there's almost no beats on Chill Out. It's, all about the melodies, being mixed in with this different like nature sounds and various, short recordings being used. Like there's obviously the throat singing that's thrown in there, and there's some samples of Elvis, Pink Floyd, Fleetwood Mac, and Van Halen, but there's some really interesting ways that they meld together on here, and it's just a very strange yet mellow experience. For its time, it definitely feels very unique, and I could just imagine like people oblivious to what's going on in the ambient field listening to this thing going, huh, this is different. Like, like what's going on with this, Like, which it is different. And I have to say, its movements and incredibly well composed and ambient sounds are just fantastic. And, it's easy to see why people would think that, back then this was just so weird and new, because, at the time it really was. It's just jam-packed with so many samples, and it's fun to recognize all of them. And, I can appreciate the more house-oriented passages towards the back half of the album, which, picked up the pace of this thing pretty well for me. Hearing the Echoes by Pink Floyd sample was pretty clever. I really like that. I didn't recognize that first, and then I just played it back to back. I'm like, oh, I see. Yeah, it is Pink Floyd. Like that just caught me off guard. Speaking of pace, it doesn't even feel like it's 45 minutes to me. I checked out how long this album was, and I thought I was only in like 25 minutes, but then it actually turned to 35. It goes by relatively fast, and despite its somewhat strange flow, I do have to say, I think that it's composed and crafted masterfully. So yeah, this is an easy essential for the ambient genre. It has some very strange yet gorgeous attributes to it. It has some excellent atmospheres and sampling. And as a whole, I think that it's a great record that deserves more than one listen. It's a piece worth coming back to. And with that in mind,
I briefly want to mention the house comment, because the KLF largely were like a house-oriented group. So this was like out of the ordinary even for them, which I think is a cool thing to note.
Okay, yeah, I'll take that into consideration. Okay, and my favorite tracks from Chill Out are Madruga Eterna, Elvis on the Radio, Steel Guitar in My Soul, 3 a.m. Somewhere Out at Beaumont and Wichita Lehman was a song I once heard, and I have no least favorite tracks.
Yeah, I honestly couldn't separate them into even separating them into tracks just felt wrong to me, because this is literally just, it feels like one big piece. And even if I was to separate, there's no moment that stands out as least favorite or favorite. It's just all fantastic.
Speaking of one big piece, let's talk about the next album. Selected Ambient Works, Volume 2 by Aphex Twin. This is the sophomore album from the pioneering and influential IDM and electronic producer Richard D. James, aka Aphex Twin, and this album came out in 1994. Aphex Twin is, in his own way, is a very essential artist for the electronic field and has numerous classic albums under his name, whether that be Selected Ambient Works 85-92, Richard D. James album, and Drux, just to name a few. He's a very eclectic artist with a very eclectic discography, but of course the main essential for the ambient genre here is the sequel to his debut, Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, which well and truly puts the ambient into Selected Ambient Works. I did it again. That's a good callback. Okay, it's easily his most ambient record, and not only that, it's just a massive album all in all. In and of itself, it's just such an ambitious and just large project in both ambition and experimentation. Since it's a whopping 2 hours and 36 minutes long, it's the longest album on this list, and I've seen a few people wince at the idea of an ambient album, being as long as it is, and understandably so, but once you actually sit down and give it a listen, you realize that it's actually a quality album that has some incredibly rewarding material to its name, and for me, I think it's essential because of what it achieves sonically, and for the fact that it's one of the most ambitious ambient albums ever made. The 24 tracks in this album are incredibly varied with what they try to achieve individually with its ideas and moods. It doesn't compromise to the listener in any way, especially with the more twisted and dark soundscape. It's all very ominous, and most of the time is just plain dark, with only a few moments that we can call soothing or beautiful. It's very cryptic and abstract with its ideas, and the great production is key in its ability to absorb you into its eerie sound palette, and it's impressive with what it does during its ambitious length. There's some amazing moments under this album's name, and despite the fact that I don't really gravitate towards every single track, it's hard to deny that the amazing moments are truly amazing, and that Aphex Twin was responsible for one of Ambient's most daring and ambitious projects, and it deserves its essential status on that merit alone.
While the first selected ambient works released from Richard is certainly his most important project, I think selected. Oh my god, I can't believe I host a podcast. The most selected ambient works too is definitely the most pure ambient project in his discography. Even though throughout his career he's definitely dabbled in ambience. This album is, as he said, massive. It's 2.5 hours long, and it's definitely a huge commitment to sit down and listen to this project from start to finish, but when you're in the right mood, it's just absolutely worth it. As I said, it's easily his most ambient, most atmospheric album, and the 24 tracks here all explore very unique, very ominous and abstract soundscapes that just never fail to floor me and transport me into its very dark and sinister world. Yet because of how, dark and sinister a lot of this album is, it really isn't, ambient in the same sense that, something like Chill Out or Ambient 1 is. It really isn't that meditative. It doesn't really transport you, aside from, a few tracks like Rhubarb, for example. A lot of it is definitely very dark, as I said, atmospherically. It's unsettling. It definitely doesn't help with anxiety like Ambient initially was meant to. But, when you're in the right mood, when you can, take it all in and lose yourself in those aforementioned dark soundscapes, I think you'll realize why this is one of the biggest achievements in ambient history, why it's such a massive accomplishment, and you'll find the beauty in it as well, because there's moments that are definitely very dark and very unsettling, but scattered in between are just absolutely hauntingly beautiful moments.
Yep. My favourite tracks are Cliffs, Rhubarb, Curtains Ropes, Blue Calcs, Z-Twig, and Matchsticks. My least favourite track is Radiator.
My favourite tracks are Rhubarb, Blue Calcs, and Lichen, and my least favourite track is White Blur 2. Alright, on to the next one. We're on to Biosphere with Substrata, which is the third studio album by Norwegian electronic musician Geir Jensen, released under the stage name Biosphere. It was released in 1997 by All Saints Records. Biosphere's home city of Tromsø in Norway really tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the inspiration behind the cold and sparse soundscapes of Substrata. As, if you're unaware, Tromsø is one of the biggest settlements inside the Arctic Circle. It's a big city up north in Norway, and Substrata acts as a perfect soundscape to the polar climate. It's largely cold, it's barren, it's sparse, but intertwined throughout are, many more comforting, more serene and warm aspects, hidden among the dense, atmospheric and cold soundscapes the project presents. Among the samples of howling Arctic wind and, other very atmospheric and very Arctic field recordings, we also get, brief samples of wood creaking and just these soothing, more relaxing instrumentals that really make this album feel kind of like a warm winter hut in the middle of like an Arctic tundra. It's definitely a unique project. It's, music that is based around Arctic climates, and just polar tundras just always fascinated me because, it's such an interesting atmosphere that I don't think gets enough exploration in terms of music, and I think that Substrata is perfectly manages to transport the listener there. It perfectly, balances field recordings and other samples with tape loops and just all the good magic that you want in an ambient project. And it's a fantastic project from start to finish, and it's a beautiful experience as well. Just like a lot of these albums, they're fantastic experiences.
Yeah, Substrata is one of those ambient records that is like perfectly encapsulated when you immediately look at the album cover. The cover for this album in particular is of this very snowy landscape with, big mountains in the distance, and from the cover alone you get a sense of coldness, mystery and isolation, all of which describes the place that you were mentioning there. And, that's exactly how Substrata sounds to me. And as an ambient experience, it's great and one of the most cold records we have on this list. Substrata is constantly enveloping and hypnotic, and, it has moments that are so mellow and ethereal, but it also has moments that are quite dark and daunting. But what keeps all of them cohesive is the fact that the sound palette is consistently icy, and we keep bringing this up, just cold. The music itself is very well crafted and composed by Biosphere, and the way that they build these soundscapes and the enveloping tracks is nothing short of fantastic. They're incredibly engaging through and through, and they really make the atmospheres just feel weirdly daunting, but with some form of solace. And it's weird. It's something weird that they try to convey, but I do really appreciate it. It's like you're floating around in like an eternal purgatory, and I really enjoy like what it manages to do for its nearly hour-long duration. It has some great moments in its track list, and it flows so seamlessly. My only issue with the album is that I much prefer the second half in comparison with the first, and the first half isn't as consistent as the last leg. But hey, this is a great ambient record all in all. It's one of the most subversive records we have in the ambient essentials, and now that I've said it, Substrata is essential. And yeah, my favorite tracks from Substrata are The Things I Tell You, Cabrisia, and Sphere of No Form. My least favorite track would have to be Chukung.
My favorite tracks are Poa Alpina, The Things I Tell You, and Cabrisia. I don't have any of these favorites.
Alright, next up we have Pop by Gas. Pop is the fourth record from German electronic producer Wolfgang Voigt under the Gas name, and it was released in 2000. Now, there's plenty of artists on this list that I've heard before and, have at least listened to something from, and Wolfgang Voigt is not one of those artists, and Pop is from his Gas moniker. It would be the first work that I'm hearing from Wolfgang, and to say that I was very satisfied with what I was hearing would be an understatement, as Pop is truly worth being mentioned as an ambient essential. Pop is in many ways just an ambient record that feels very compacted with some really dense, textured and layered ideas, while at the same time it feels kind of welcoming and calm. I find it to be one of the more accessible records that we're talking about on our list, but that doesn't take away from the ideas and presentation itself, since Pop is still a great album in that regard. Wolfgang ends up creating some incredibly dense and textured soundscapes throughout its runtime, with some serene and hypnotic loops, nature recordings, and sounds that give it a very grounded and natural edge. An eclectic array of ideas on each individual track is really appreciated, whether that be the additional instrumentation we see on moments like the second track, and the minimal techno beats on tracks 4 and 7, and with the varied moods and dense mixes we see spread across the whole track list. It's just adding some kind of variety to what we're seeing. The songs themselves are pretty lengthy, but they remain engaging for what they are. There are very few moments where I wished more was done dynamically, since I just think it's really great. But the whole thing is just fantastic. I really enjoyed it. It was produced well. I really like what Wolfgang brought to the table here. And yeah, as a whole, it was a really great album that deserves to be recognized as an essential.
Yeah, from one album largely influenced by nature to another, whereas Substrata was, the soundtrack to an Arctic tundra and boreal forest, Pop is definitely a lot more summery, a lot more bright. And I think there's a word in Japanese that doesn't translate directly into English. I think perfectly describes the sound of this album, and that word is komarebi, which is the word for sunlight that filters through leaves in a forest. It's a very specific word, but I think that imagery perfectly describes what Gas sounds like to me. The beauty of the field recordings Gas presents on Pop is really quite spectacular. But what's even more spectacular is what he manages to do with those field recordings. He turns them into these hypnotic, repetitive, and psychedelic ambient techno gems, and overall the sound of this project is just so serene, so beautiful, and it's almost just, it's insane how these field recordings, these nature recordings, just perfectly blend with this ambient techno style, which definitely gives kind of like a nature meets technology feel to the album. And overall, compositionally, this project is amazing. It's just, there's not going to be a lot of ambient techno on this list because a lot of that falls heavily under IDM as well, and that's a separate episode. But this album in particular is one that just definitely fits the pure ambient style and the kind of the baseline set by Brian Eno on Ambient 1 perfectly, and I think it definitely deserves a spot as an essential on a list of ambient albums.
Yep, I agree. My favorite tracks are Pop 2, Pop 5, and Pop 7. If I had to pick a least favorite, I'd probably go with Pop 1.
My favorite are Pop 2, 4, and 7. My least favorite is Pop 5. Okay. I'm sorry, man. Next up, we have Silent Hill 2 by Akira Yamaoka. This is the soundtrack to the 2001 cult classic survival horror game Silent Hill 2, a series which is well renowned for its magnificent soundtracks, as well as pretty much everything else. But for now, we're talking about the soundtracks. This isn't a game podcast. Yeah, ambient music has the ability to paint atmospheres and invoke feelings, and ambient music and video games are therefore just a match made in heaven. That's why this is definitely not the last video game soundtrack you'll be hearing about today. Yeah, but I think there's probably no soundtrack that could have better encapsulated the dark and twisted story of Silent Hill 2. What Akira Yamaoka assembled here is just absolutely magic. The soundtrack is absolutely one of the darkest things I've ever heard, not in a traditional sense, but similarly to the game its soundtracks, it's absolutely desolate in an almost surreal way, yet there's something, there's like an ever-present sense of humanity and just emotion present throughout, which just it makes it so unnerving and just so, as I said, surreal. There's plenty of moments on here that almost sound hopeful and uplifting in a way, but in a way that just feels like it's nothing but a dream. It's not rooted in reality. It's just so dark, it's twisted, and the compositions here are just so engaging. It's probably one of the most compositionally engaging ambient albums. Like, there's moments on here that are guaranteed to get stuck in your head, which isn't something you can say about a lot of ambient albums. And it's just it's beautiful. It's easily one of the best examples of a soundtrack album being able to perfectly stand on its own as a separate album, because listening to this project outside the context of the game is just, it doesn't really take away anything from the album. It's fantastic. I love it. Hell yeah.
Yeah, Silent Hill 2, generally speaking, is probably one of the most beloved horror games ever made, and even though I've never played the game for myself, I was incredibly excited to hear what the equally acclaimed soundtrack had to offer, since it's beloved by so many, and it's considered one of the best video game soundtracks of all time. And to say that I was satisfied would be an understatement, since Silent Hill 2's soundtrack is a great yet eclectic soundtrack that, on its own is fantastic, and as an ambient album are just amazing. It's done incredibly well, and we'd have to consider it a classic for the ambient genre. So at a whopping during its runtime, Akira Yamaoka masterfully crafts a soundtrack that manages to build upon an incredible sounding atmosphere that's often desolate, but despite it being made for a horror game, it's actually kind of emotive, kind of ethereal and beautiful. Plus, even though we're including it in the ambient category, it's actually a pretty eclectic and varied album that features influences from other sounds like alternative rock, industrial, and trip hop. Admittedly, though, there are a few times where it just kind of sounded awkward going from just this blissful ambient track to this riffy rock number. But hey, that only happens like twice, and the rest of the material on here is enough to suffice. It's a somber yet melancholic album, and while I feel like it doesn't really have that many moments that fit the quote-unquote horror tag, it perfectly fits the iconic atmosphere that people often bring up when they talk about Silent Hill 2. It has plenty of fantastic soundscapes and moments that are just so great, and they truly absorb you into the soundtrack experience. And while there's certainly a lot of tracks in this thing that kind of flew over my head, felt awkward and or underwhelming, I still took away plenty of fantastic moments from Silent Hill 2, and we'll get to talk about it again soon, maybe. We'll see. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack are Theme of Laura, White Noise, The Day of Night, No One Love You, Terror in the Depths of the Fog, and Promise. My least favorite track is The Reverse Will.
My favorite tracks are Theme of Laura, Heaven's Night, and The Day of Night. My least favorite track is Angels Thanatos.
Okay, moving on, we are going to go to the Tired Sounds of Stars of Lid by Stars of Lid. This is the 6th album from the American ambient duo Stars of Lid, which consists of Adam Wills, I hope I'm saying that right, and Brian McBride. And the Tired Sounds of Stars of Lid came out in 2001. Now, another one of the most beloved artists in the modern age of ambient, and they're another one of these ambient artists that I never got to check out prior to creating this list. The Tired Sounds of is often seen as their masterpiece among ambient fans, and I was pretty excited to give this 2-hour behemoth a listen to see if it was worth the hype. And why we'd call it an essential is, for me, based off of this album's ambitiousness and its length, and with what it tries to do with its soundscapes texturally, and how these droney pieces are composed. It definitely has its very tranquil and beautiful moments within its 2 hours of ambient minimalism, and generally speaking, it's a very pleasant and good sounding album. But if I'm being honest here, I just think it's a solid record on its own, and personally, I'm not too blown away by it. For me, I just feel like its length and the straightforward droniness of the album kind of makes it drag on, and it can kind of overstay its welcome, and there's a few sequences that I just don't find all that great personally. Like, they're nice, but nothing that blows me away, especially when we take the records that we've covered in this list already into consideration. Plus, while I was listening through, I did find it hard to pay attention. I was kind of zoning out for both times that I listened to it, admittedly. It wasn't totally engaging me, and I can understand, so there could be some frustration, but, it's whatever. So yeah, I do like what it tries to present, but, like, I feel like it just isn't as engaging as I hoped it would be. I do think it has merit to it, and I'm sure there's plenty of people that will like this thing way more than I do. But with that being said, what the fuck am I saying? I respect it for what it represents for ambient music and for its ambition, but I don't find it totally compelling.
Boo!
I'm sorry. Shoot me now.
It's fine. I just don't get to do that often. It's usually the other way around.
True, actually, true.
Yeah, sometimes less is more, and with the Tired Sounds of Stars of the Lid, I think that statement is perfectly exemplified. This album is just 2 hours of just very sparse and ethereal and very minimalist ambient droning and encapsulated within our very meditative field recordings. And while, sure, it's definitely not a record for every occasion, it's an album that is so hollow yet serene in its soundscapes that it genuinely sounds like an escape. Like, listening to this project with a good pair of headphones and allowing yourself to focus on it and get lost in it is honestly just feels like an out-of-body experience. It's just one of the most calming, most warm albums I've ever heard in my life. And every second of this project is just life-affirmingly gorgeous and tranquil, unlike a lot of things I've heard. It's a fantastic album. I think that despite its length, for me personally, I'm always a little iffy with long albums, but this one was just one that immediately clicked, was very easy for me to digest and get into. And I think if you have 2 hours to spend, I think this project is one that is definitely not hard to appreciate and not hard to lose yourself in, even if you're like me, not the best in terms of attention span and get distracted quite easily. I think this album feels like almost an exercise in meditation. It's gorgeous. I love what the Stars of the Lid did here with their droney loops and with their field recordings, and overall it just creates one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard in ambient music.
Alright, my favourite tracks from the Tired Sounds of are Requiem for Dying Mothers Part 1 and 2, Mulholland and Piano Accu. My least favourite tracks are Broke Labours 1, 2 and 3.
My favourite tracks are Requiem for Dying Mothers Part 1 and 2 and The Lonely People Are Getting Lonelier. My least favourite track is Gas Farming. Up next, we have the Disintegration Loops, which is a series of 4 albums by American avant-garde composer William Basinski, released in 2002 and 2003. For the purpose of this video, we're only going to look at the first album in the series, as it's undoubtedly the most famous and, well, the best as well. And whether you believe William Basinski's story behind these albums or doubt its validity like a lot of people do, I think the story of the Disintegration Loops is certainly a fascinating one, and one which definitely adds a lot of potency to the music. The story goes William Basinski was, planning on moving a lot of his old tape loops from the 80s and the 90s onto digital format, and as he was doing that, he noticed that gradually the tape head was quite literally disintegrating the tape loops, And, the more he looped them and recorded them over and over again, the more just messy and sparse and just disjointed the loops got. And this immediately clicked with Basinski, and he would go on to create a series of 4 albums titled The Disintegration Loops, as I mentioned. However, as I mentioned, we're only going to be talking about the first one here. But I mean, by all means, listen to all 4 of them. I think they're all good, and I think they're all worth your time. But the first one is really where it's at. But anyways, according to Basinski, he finished work on this project while he was in his New York apartment with his friend, and the date was the morning of September 11th, 2001. When towers were hit, Basinski pressed play on the first track, 1.1, and, he watched the madness ensue in front of him as these loops played out throughout the rest of the day into the night. And in his own words, the events just gave new meaning to the musical pieces created by catastrophic decay in the studio a few weeks earlier. A lot of people don't really believe the story. They think that Basinski just kind of used 9/11 as a way to propel these albums into the limelight. But whether or not you believe that story or not, I think the imagery associated with such a tragedy definitely adds a lot of weight to the pieces that are found on the Disintegration Loops. An album of just beautiful music falling apart and crumbling over itself, conjuring images of an event in which millions of people lost loved ones, and the whole world watched in terror and confusion and felt like their entire world was falling apart. It's really dark. It's just unbelievably dark, but it also is just insanely powerful. And I think that the weight that such an event added to these albums probably added a lot of critical acclaim onto them too. I still believe that even without the story, I think this album is still gorgeous, and the concept that Basinski explores is definitely interesting. I think it's executed very well, and I find it interesting that the music created here was created by chance. There was no manipulation. It was just whatever happens kind of thing. But I think with the story attached to it, it definitely adds a very powerful aspect to it.
William Basinski's The Disintegration Loops is probably one of the more infamous albums on this list here, and while I don't like to be one of those people that says you need context for this album, for an album, but the story that The Disintegration Loops has feels so integral to the album itself, and it kind of needs to be said. Whether you believe if William actually witnessed what happened that day and played the loops while that was happening is up to you. Like, you believe what you believe. Personally, I do believe him. Personally, I do believe him, and the Disintegration Loops just, I don't know. It adds such a huge emotional weight to the soundscapes and the beauty of this album. Like, you can't help but put yourself in that moment and imagine, what William supposedly saw that day in New York. But when it comes to the album itself, it just gets better for me with every listen, and I've been coming back to it a lot. And this album is seriously addicting to me. It's funny because both the tracks in this album are just continuous, ambient loops that are slowly decaying and disintegrating. The first one being an hour long, but there's just something so evocative and ethereal about what William Basinski did on here. And to quote our boy A Bucket of Jake, the exact moment in time is what Basinski unconsciously captured to near perfection. It gives off the feelings and emotions that people who witnessed what happened that day, confusion, fear, melancholy. The decaying loops just put me in this trance-like state, and the repetitive and dying soundscapes just sounded amazing to me. And I shit you not, at one point when I was listening to this album, it just broke me. I swear to God. And I just feel like I need to mention this, even though I've never delved far into this genre's works. I was told that this album was pretty influential to the sounds for Vaporwave too. Whether that's true or not, I have no clue. I guess I'll just have to leave that up to the more experienced listeners. But I will definitely do my research on that. So yeah, the Disintegration Loops is an amazing experience. It's one of the most heavily poignant ambient albums ever made, and when I turn it on and listen, I'm just transported to a completely different melancholic world. I've truly become the doomer because of this album, and I don't care. I think the Disintegration Loops is an amazing record, and it's one of my favorites on the list, and not to mention, it's essential. Favorite tracks, all of them. No least favorite tracks. Yeah.
Yeah, same.
All right, so moving on to the actually last few albums on our list, we have Rave Death 1972 by Tim Hecker. This is the seventh studio album from Canadian ambient producer Tim Hecker, and Rave Death 1972 came out in 2011. Tim Hecker is definitely one of the most acclaimed names in the lane of modern ambient drone music. He's got a few other classic albums under his name, but we decided to go with his 2011 effort, Rave Death 1972, which is an album that is very interesting in what it tries to achieve in terms of texture, since I feel like the sound mix feels a bit thicker and a bit beefy without feeling overwhelming. Plus, it's an incredibly dense album too that has some really interesting minor nuances and interesting details that one could miss, and generally speaking, it's one of the most intricate ambient albums on this list in contrast with a lot of other stuff out there. Plus, I feel like this album and many others like it make Tim an essential album artist in the ambient field. Oh my god, I'm stumbling over myself. Rave Death, what the fuck? Rave Death is proof to my ears, since it's a very good helping of very layered and textured ambient with a bit of dystopia and noise being brought into the mix. Within this denseness, we are given a mood that feels very apocalyptic in its sound palette. It sounds big as well. There's some soundscapes and tracks on here that honestly just blew me away the first time I ever heard them. And while I don't really love every track on here, there's so much to savor since they just sound immaculate. The compositions and flow of this album is very solid as well. The noisier sections are pretty dope, and as a whole experience, it was pretty intriguing. Like I said earlier, there's a few moments here and there that aren't all that great to me personally, but there's a fair amount that I did like, and even if I didn't enjoy all of the ideas that Tim decided to go with on here, I think that it's a good album all in all.
Tim Hecker's Rave Death 1972 is perhaps the most bleak album on this list, and I don't mean that as an insult. It creates just very dense and noisy atmospheres with its drones, but this whole project just conjures up images of just loneliness, of melancholy, of isolation, and the extensive use of pipe organ throughout this project, also adds so much suspensefulness and, as I said, melancholy to this project. It really is an album that it doesn't feel beautiful at all. It just feels dark and ugly, but in the best way possible. It's also certainly a very eclectic album. It takes a lot of inspirations from various corners of the music map and combines them into an experience that is just haunting. It feels like this whole album is just cursed. But, with all that, it does add a certain kind of type of beauty to it. And overall, I'm not going to lie, it's not my favorite album on this list, but it's one that I still have come back to once or twice since. And I still definitely understand why this album gets as much love as it does. But while it is a very good album, I just wasn't entirely blown away by it. Maybe it's because I am more familiar with his later works, and I've just kind of felt like maybe some of the material here I've heard before. But, still, when it does things right, this project is just mesmerizing and just haunting in a weirdly beautiful way. And overall, it still definitely, I think, would qualify as an essential. I still, don't doubt and respect all of the acclaim that it gets. It's just not my favorite on the list.
Right, my favorite tracks from Rave Death 1972. Did I say deaf again? What the fuck? you think, like, I know we said this before, but you think when we considered starting a podcast, we'd actually be able to fucking speak. Like, Jesus Christ. Alright, my favorite...
I feel like I've gotten worse at speaking.
True, actually. What the fuck? Right, so my favorite tracks from Rave Death 1972 are The Piano Drop, No Drums, and The Hatred of Music 1, 2, and 3. My least favorite track is In the Fog 1, 2, and 3.
My favorite tracks are The Piano Drop, Hatred of Music 1, and In the Air 3. My least favorite track is Analog Paralysis 1978. Okay, up next is Minecraft Volume Alpha by C418. The first soundtrack to a game which I'm sure needs no introduction, composed by Daniel Rosenfeld, aka C418. For a lot of people my age and younger, I think it's safe to say that Minecraft Volume Alpha was an introduction to ambient music. Whether I understood what ambient music was at the time, it certainly was the first experience I've had with the genre. And honestly, I think it's a pretty good introduction to ambient music. It's a very easy to digest, yet still very powerful and outstandingly produced ambient project, which definitely serves as a very good entry into the world of ambient. The way I would describe the soundtrack is overwhelmingly serene, but in a bittersweet way, and I think that's furthered by just how prevalent a lot of these tracks were to my childhood. It's honestly one of the most nostalgic albums to me, and just the idea that this album is just so nostalgic for the same exact reasons to so many people is really just it adds a beauty to this project that I don't think you could have synthetically added to it. It definitely comes with the circumstances around it. And also, I think the way that it's implemented into the game is genius. Since Minecraft has no story, none of the tracks here will conjure up, the same memories for a lot of people in the same way that, tracks from the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack would. Instead, these tracks almost appear at random throughout the game and almost act like soundtracks to just fragments of time of childhoods. And, this, translates into real life perfectly. And, the songs all conjure up very vivid imagery of fragments in time of my childhood. And I know it's the exact same story with millions of people worldwide, which is just, I think, special. It's just a pure and magical album. And, I'm forever going to be grateful to C418 for creating something that so effortlessly brings me back to my early years and, unlike anything else I've ever heard. And all it took was a few relatively simple but really beautiful ambient tracks.
Yeah, generally speaking, when you look back at popular culture in the 2010s, one of the first things that I think should pop into your head if you came of age during that time, like me and you did, is Minecraft. That game was such a huge thing, and its influence wasn't just restricted to gaming, but you also felt its presence in other forms of media. But of course, since we're a music podcast, the one thing that we're interested in the most should be obvious to you all. The unreleased Minecraft movie starring Steve Carell as Steve. Nah.
That was good, man. You nailed that one.
Oh yeah. Nah, honestly, the Minecraft soundtrack, Volume Alpha to be specific, is like you said, it was an introduction. It was an introduction to ambient music, whether we knew it or not. But to be specific, it's amazing to me. And as an album, I just love it so much. It's a perfect album to me. I don't care what anyone says. I will admit, I've huge attachments to Minecraft as a game when I was younger. I would always play split screen with my cousin on his PS4. I played it all the time and had such a such a laugh with my friends, playing online, even in single player environment. I just loved exploring Minecraft and just playing survival mode. And along the way, I was accompanied by C418's very comforting, peaceful, tranquil, and just downright beautiful soundtrack. Every melody and every soundscape is just incredibly nostalgic for me. I absolutely adore the way the album sounds, and the fact that it invokes just so many happy memories and fun times mucking about with my friends is just nothing short of amazing to me. And I will always appreciate it for its nostalgic qualities, even when I'm in my 30s or my 40s. Every track on this album is just incredibly iconic. The melodies are incredibly recognizable. I love C418's production and compositions. I think that he does an amazing job at providing such an incredibly peaceful and mellow backdrop when you are committing mass genocide against poor villagers. Words can't describe just how incredible this album is to me and how important it is for me. Everyone's nostalgic experiences are incredibly different, but, millions of people definitely see Minecraft as a huge point of nostalgia for everybody who grew up with the game. And I adore this thing. I love it to death, and it's a masterpiece. And yeah, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Minecraft Volume Alpha, well, all of them, but if I had to pick some specifics, I would go with Subwoofer Lullaby, Minecraft, and Mice on Venus. I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorites are Subwoofer Lullaby, Minecraft, and Sweden. My least favorite track, I guess, is Death.
No, Death.
It doesn't conjure up nice memories. It's the only one that doesn't.
No, dude, come on. That one is funny.
It's just a chicken dying.
It takes me back to fun times in the village.
I guess.
Oh, Jesus, fun times murdering chickens. What the fuck is wrong with me? Alright, so we're on to our final two albums on the list. So we have Grouper, Aia Alien Observer. This is the 7th studio album from American ambient producer, singer, and songwriter Liz Harris, aka Grouper, and this came out in 2011. Now, Grouper is another very popular and acclaimed artist in the modern ambient landscape, and Aia Alien Observer is an album that I've seen floating around for years now, mostly because of the album cover, since I love that cover. It's fantastic to me. It also happens to be the first part of a double album, the second part being Dream Loss. You know, I haven't heard it yet, but we're mainly focusing on the first part here, which on one hand feels a bit wrong to do, but whatever. You know, I listened to this thing a few times, and each time I've come away from it just as mesmerized as when I first heard it, because this album is just fantastic from start to finish for me. Alien Observer is just, you know, this incredibly spacious, ethereal, and for lack of better words, just beautiful album that has some incredibly immaculate soundscapes to be found in its lo-fi aesthetic, but at the same time, it's layered over some incredibly alien yet equally as beautiful vocals. Now, it's a record that feels like one of the more daring ambient projects in the modern landscape, since it's pulling from influences like dream pop and drone, and I feel like it culminates so well together to create such just a vibrant and otherworldly atmosphere that doesn't belong on this earth, really. You know, Liz's rough production plays incredibly well to the soundscape she builds upon, and, you know, her ideas are very varied. She creates one of the more unique and realized ambient projects ever, in my opinion. It has some, you know, incredibly, like, it has some amazing moments to its name. It has some, I enjoy the rougher production and recording of this thing. It adds a ton to the album, in my opinion, and as a whole, it just blew me away first time I heard it. So yeah, I think that this project from Grouper is a fantastic inclusion in our essentials. I think the way that Liz incorporates different ideas and sounds as well as her vocals into the soundscapes make this one of the more interesting and unique records on our list. And I think that it sounds fantastic. I loved every second of it, and as a whole, I feel like it is an essential.
Yeah, Alien Observer is a very fitting title for an album, which to me is the perfect soundtrack to just stargazing and feeling completely tiny and inconsequential in the vastness of the universe. I think Liz Harris, you know, drowns a already very spacey and atmospheric dream pop foundation in just this beautiful thick fog of reverb and ethereally beautiful ambience and just gorgeously dense droning. It truly feels like an out-of-body experience. It feels like something out of this world. It feels alien, but also just very familiar and comforting. It's just hypnotizingly peaceful in the most spectacular way. And, you know, it just, again, blends dream pop and ambience so effortlessly. It just, unlike anything I've heard since, except for maybe other projects from Liz. It's an absolutely unique album when it comes to this essential episodes. It's the only one with prevalent vocals throughout, for one. And, you know, the vocals here definitely serve their role to add to the ambience. They act as an instrument. It genuinely feels just like a high, this album, from start to finish. It's incredible. It's otherworldly, and the title is just perfect as well. Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites, and it's a long-time favorite of mine. Also, a very good album to fall asleep to.
Alright, my favorite tracks from AIA Alien Observer are Moon is Sharp, Vapor Trails, and She Loves Me That Way. I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks are Moon is Sharp, Alien Observer, and Vapor Trails. My least favorite track, if I had to pick, would be Mary on the Wall. And last but not least, we have The Caretaker with An Empty Bliss Beyond This World. An Empty Bliss Beyond This World is the 9th studio album by The Caretaker, an ambient music project of English musician Leyland Kirby, released in 2011. While The Caretaker is widely known and acclaimed for his Everywhere at the End of Time series of albums, there is absolutely no way we could ever include a 6-part series of albums that is just so daunting and admittedly just a little too much to talk about in a podcast format. We'd have to dedicate a whole episode to that thing.
Honestly,
and also admittedly, it's just so daunting that I've never sat down and listened to the whole thing from start to finish. I've only heard snippets. I am well aware that listening to it will probably ruin my day. So I'm saving that for another time. However, luckily for us, there is an album from The Caretaker that isn't too dissimilar from that project. And it actually came a few years before the first album in the Everywhere at the End of Time series came about, and that is An Empty Bliss Beyond This Empty World, which, you know, has similar themes at its core, and also presents a very similar sound aesthetic. For anyone unfamiliar with the series of albums, which I'm sure is like 4 people listening right now, it's a portrayal of the experiences of suffering from dementia, and the way that Leyland Kirby achieves this is by skewing and dissecting loops from old ragtime and Dixieland singles from, you know, way back when, in a way that makes them feel very warm and pleasant, yet also uncomfortably, like ever so slightly unrecognizable. And it just adds so much just weird, unsettling atmosphere to this album. It's just the idea of something that was once so warm that, you know, something that back in the 30s people would just listen to in, you know, for leisure. It was just a fun time. Being able to skew those kind of old memories attached to those albums in a way that feels just so dissonant and just so lost and confused in the modern day is just, I think, a perfect way to, you know, describe the tragic and the just terrifying idea of dementia in music form. You know, aside from that aspect of the music, I also think that what the Caretaker does with these loops is just genius. I think that, you know, the assembly, the atmosphere that he presents, the specific loops that he chooses, all just add up to something that is fantastic. And, you know, it's definitely acts as like a bite-size chunk of what you can expect to see on, well, here on Everywhere at the End of Time. But I think as a standalone album, this is still a very good project. I know that for a lot of people it kind of lives in the shadow of the aforementioned 6-part project, but for someone just getting into the Caretaker like myself, this was definitely a very good place to start, and it is definitely more appropriate of a video like this than a very abstract 6-part album experience that will probably ruin your day. So
yeah, I'm sure all of you know at this point by now, but, you know, for the 4 people who don't, Leyland Kirby, aka the Caretaker, is, you know, very well known for being the mastermind behind the 6-hour Everywhere at the End of Time, which I still have yet to hear, but I will eventually. I'm not that sad right now. But for now, we're gonna mention one of his most popular releases under the Caretaker name, that being An Empty Bliss Beyond This World, which for me is another really good record that we have in our essentials. It has its own unique atmosphere and sound to it in comparison with the other projects here, and despite being a little predictable at times, it has some really haunting yet blissful moments. You know, the Caretaker style is an interesting one, since, you know, the template that he uses, well, I guess template would be a bit harsh, but, you know, he basically samples the sounds that, you know, that are taken from like 1920s and 30s like British dance band music, and, you know, on top of that he layers some turntable record effects, and, you know, as well as some ambient soundscapes, and as a result he ends up creating a sound that seems, you know, invokes a lot of familiar like sounds, but on the surface it's somewhat jolly, and at the same time it just gives you a sense of like something is off, you know, tonally as well. It has this somewhat very eerie and spooky vibe to it, and the music itself also has a progression to it that does, you know, feel inspired by the Disintegration Loops, in my opinion, as, you know, these looped pieces slowly become more glitchy and haunting as it goes on. And, you know, I know a lot of people like to think of this as like a precursor to Everywhere at the End of Time, and, you know, I can see that. I feel like the sample choices and some of the tracks on the thing are stunning, and, you know, the haunting atmospheres are done incredibly well by Leyland Kirby. You know, around the middle though, I felt like it was getting a tad bit predictable, and I was slowly losing a bit of interest. You know, it picked up again, and I do really enjoy a lot of it. But, you know, just that bit in the middle was kind of stagnant for me. So yeah, the Caretaker made a very interesting and unique ambient record with An Empty Bliss Beyond This World, and while I don't love it, I still enjoy it, and I think it's worth being called an essential ambient album. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from An Empty Bliss Beyond This World are All You're Going to Want to Do Is Get Back There, Le Bet's Delay, and All You Are Going to Want to Do Is Get Back There. Wait, did I put that twice? What the fuck? Am I tripping? I am tripping. I am tripping. Dementia. Oh fuck no. Alright, my least favourite track is Mental Caverns Without Sunshine. Oh my god.
It's hard to pick favorite tracks because there's just so many good things, but 2 definitely stand above the rest, and that's All You're Going to Want to Do Is Get Back There and Le Bet's Delay. My least favorite track, probably bedded deep in long-term memory if I had to pick. But that track is pretty good, so.
Okay, fair enough. So, yep, we did it. We talked about all the ambient essentials. Woo!
Woohoo!
So yeah, thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope that you enjoyed. We hope that you get to check out some of these records, that you get to experience a lot of these ambient albums as kind of like how we did. We hope that you get some really great stuff out of it. And, of course, necessary links will be in the description to the Taped Podcast Discord server. You can come chat with us there and just have a bit of a laugh and a bit of a discussion with other like-minded people. Be sure to check out our links to our own album of the year and rate your music pages, as well as our own individual YouTube channels. And with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
Bye.
Peace and love.
We'll see